put the Dynamo aside for now. I did try the last few tests that were mentioned, and it passed those tests, and it does work as a motor. So I'm at a bit of a loss as to why it's not generating much voltage at all. It is consistent, so if you spin it slowly, it generates a low voltage, but the most I can get out of it is about 130, 140 millivolts, which is way too low. So I've gone back onto trying to get the rear wheels on the car. The bearing I ordered arrived, and I've pressed that into the end of the torque tube. I used an old muff coupling because it's the same spline as down the other end of the torque tube, so you can slide that over the spline that goes into the universal and hammer this home to get the bearing to seat home. That worked really well. This is the new spring and plunger, and that goes in there, and that takes up the any end float on the drive shaft and the universal here. So now all I need to do is put this back together with the shim, which dropped down there. That goes in there, and I can then start looking at the rear half shafts. As always, it seems to be a little bit of a struggle. I have a ratchet strap around the rear axle and the chassis member. Somebody suggested this in the comments, and it's a really good idea. With the rear axle sitting on the jack, it can roll backwards and forwards, and I can put tension on it with the ratchet strap. The issue I've got is it's not closing up correctly here, and I thought some of that was just the spring tension on the little plunger. You do have to make sure that the plunger is actually engaged in the hole. What can happen is it can slide out and then lift out of the hole, and it'll stop you pushing this home. But I don't think that's the problem. I think the issue is that the bearing isn't fully seated yet. You can see I've got about 1/8 of an inch to go, and it's as far forward as it will go. So it's basically hitting the back of the U-joint. So the back of the U-joint is hitting the face of the bearing in here, so it can't go any more forwards. So I'm going to have to take it apart again and just make sure that bearing is really truly seated down. Okay, after giving it a really decent whack with the old muff coupler and a decent sized hammer, I actually got the bearing to move back about another half inch. So I think I'm pretty confident it'll go back together now. This is what I mean about this is the pin. You need to make sure that it actually engages in the hole, because otherwise you can see it could get caught on the edge there and you can't push it in. So make sure it actually is engaged in the hole in the end of the drive shaft like that before you try to slide this all together. So I think that should be it now. This should now go together nicely. So now the torque tube is all nicely in place, bolted up properly. I tested with the jack, it goes up and down okay, but no in and out movement. So I've moved on to the rear hubs. The first thing to do was fit the little brake rod bushes, brake cam bushes. They just sort of fit on the back there, and the brake rods go across and float in the end of the axle here, so I need to sort out the felt pads that go in there. I just wanted to make sure everything was lined up properly. I've put the hub seal backing plate in place, and then I just tapped the bearing home over the end. I just tapped it round with a brass drift, tapped it down, and then put on the big nut and the spring clip. The gasket, I probably don't really need it because this is all sealed bearings and things now, but I'm going to put it in there anyway, and just out of habit I sealed it with spray on blue Hylamar. So to keep all of that aligned, I just use a couple of studs, and I should now be able to slide home go. It's probably going to take 2 hands, but I should now be able to push that home, put the bolts in here to pull it all up, and that's the rear hub's done. Hopefully there's nothing I've forgotten, because it'll be a pain to take all this apart again. I have ordered new bolts here because these ones are pretty mangled. I found a nice set to go on the front, but these are what the leftover ones are, so I'm just going to do it up with a couple of bolts for now probably, or put them all in loosely. But it's almost on its wheels. That's one side done now. It's actually quite hard to get the hub to go over that bearing. I used a piece of plastic on the end of the hub and then hit it with my lump hammer to get it to go home. On the other one, I've remembered to clean off any paint on the inside of that surface where the bearing goes, which will hopefully make it a little bit easier. By the time I realized on this one that I should have done that it was already on there and I didn't want to try pulling it off. The one thing you do have to avoid is don't try and put bolts through here and pull it on using this back plate. That will just warp that plate. That's why a lot of them, I think, a lot of them you see are warped, because people have tried to do that. So that's one side done. It's looking pretty good. I'll go on to the other side now. So finally, after years and years of just being a pile of parts, it's sitting on its wheels. And that's quite a milestone, really. It seems to be sitting correctly. Everything rolled okay. The only tricky thing at the moment is not having a gear selector on there. The gears sometimes slip into mesh. But that's basically a rolling chassis now. And you really get an idea of how low it's going to be when you consider the bonnet. The bonnet line is right near the top of the engine there. The steering wheel is in pretty much the position it needs to be in. You can see there isn't a lot of clearance between the chassis and the rear axle there. I guess once there's a little bit more weight in the car and a fuel tank at the back and things like that, it'll lower down a little bit. Even with me standing on it, the springs are pretty stiff. Effectively the springs need to be flat when it's all loaded up, so I'm not too far off that. Same on the front there. So I think it's actually looking pretty good. I'm back in Big Shed now. I've rolled it back in. The steering all works fine. Everything rolls fine. There's no strange scraping noises or graunching noises. I should probably fill up the differential with oil. And I've now started parking the MG there to leave all the space free so I can start thinking about the body and things like that on this car. Obviously there's still a lot to do, but it's just so good to see it sitting there as a rolling chassis and looking like a car. It's taken a very, very long time to get to this stage. My friend Joss started collecting parts years and years and years ago, and got hold of this replica chassis, collected a ton of bits. But it's just taken such a long time to actually do something with it. So it's kind of a shame Joss isn't around to see this, but I like to think he's up there looking down, probably saying I'm doing it all wrong, but I think he'd approve. I think he'd be pleased to see it like this. So next, engine, and send the clutch parts off to be balanced now that I got new bolts for that. So I can actually get in touch with the engineer. I'll ring him tomorrow and find out when he's going to be free, and see if I can go along and take all the stuff to be balanced, and I can start assembling the actual engine. But yeah, just so pleased. I think it's going to look really good in here as well.